Today's video is sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community filled with thousands of inspiring classes to help you explore your creativity. If you're looking to deepen existing passions or discover new interests, Skillshare offers a variety of classes to help get you lost in your creativity. Whether those ambitions are music and music production, creative writing, or even YouTube-related interests like marketing and film, Skillshare gives you the tools necessary to develop those skills along with like-minded creatives. A class that caught my eyes was Productivity for Creatives, Build a System That Brings Out Your Best by Thomas Frank. Productivity is something that I've struggled with in the past. I often found myself getting distracted while working, which would cause my productivity to greatly decrease. However, Mr. Frank's class helped me get into a more professional mindset. His course covers important pillars such as how to tailor your physical and digital work environment, and how to use your talents both efficiently and effectively. I highly recommend anyone check out this class if they're looking for ways to improve their productivity, since it provides a lot of great methods for doing so, such as the 20-second rule, for example. Skillshare is curated specifically for learning, which means that there are no ads and you can stay focused and feel like your time is valued. Skillshare's classes are also split into short bite-sized lessons, which means that they're very easy to slot into your daily schedule. What's also great is that they're doing a special offer right now. The first 1,000 of you to click the link in the description or use my code Compendium will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so you can immediately go and start exploring your creativity. Once again, major thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. It's hard to think of many games that left as much of an immediate impact as 2002's Kingdom Hearts. While its premise was strange and easy to make fun of, Kingdom Hearts 1 was an incredibly ambitious game. It managed to translate the turn-based combat of a Final Fantasy game into a real-time action game setting rather effortlessly, and the Disney coat of paint served as a solid backdrop to levels. This strange combination of ideas made the game instantly stand out, not just from Square's own library, but in the entire gaming industry. Combine this with a solid amount of content, a beautiful soundtrack, and a cheesy but charming story, and you end up with a game that might not have aged well in a few areas, but is better than the sum of its parts, and deserves to be recognized as a classic. What's most impressive to me, however, is that the story had a somewhat downer of an ending for this kind of game. You would expect a game tied so heavily to Disney to have a happy ending where everyone gets what they want in the end, but that's not entirely the case. Sure, Ansem was defeated and the many worlds were saved, but our trio's main goals go unfulfilled. Riku and King Mickey end up staying on the other side of Kingdom Hearts, and Sora is once again separated from Kairi. There's a sense of melancholy that you wouldn't expect, and this feeling is carried over into the game's direct sequel. Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories was released for the Game Boy Advance back in 2004, before receiving a PlayStation 2 remake in 2007. It was created to be an intermediary title to help tie fans over until the release of Kingdom Hearts 2. While I can appreciate the attempts to try something unique in terms of gameplay, ultimately it makes Chain of Memories a title that I don't visit that often. Undoubtedly, the best part about this game to me was its story. While the story of Chain of Memories is interesting enough on its own, it's mainly used to establish certain plot elements for Kingdom Hearts 2 to explore. It raised the stakes from the first game and introduced us to this organization in black hoodies, a young girl named Naminé, and a mysterious man named Diz. We're also given an update on the whereabouts of Riku and King Mickey, and the story is capped off with Sora, Donald, and Goofy being placed in a deep sleep in order to have their memories restored. I know I'm skimming over a lot of the details, but that's because I'm making the assumption that you've either played these games or have seen the videos I've made on them already. But why do I bother to bring this up in the first place? Well, the answer is quite simple. When looking at a game so far removed from its release, it's easy to forget the time leading up to it. Chain of Memories left the characters in an even worse state than they were in previously. This downward spiral helped build up Kingdom Hearts 2 as a special event. This was a game that needed to happen. Not only were people clamoring for more of what Kingdom Hearts 1 provided, but the ending of Chain of Memories was begging for a follow-up. And in late 2005 in Japan and early 2006 in North America, we finally got that sequel. Kingdom Hearts 2 is remembered for a lot of things. It's known for its mechanically rich and engaging combat system, the huge bump in presentation from the first game, and the stellar soundtrack once again composed by Yoko Shimomura. However, Kingdom Hearts 2 is also cited as the point where the series' narrative became far too complex for its own good. One of these things isn't quite like the other, and while this is a sentiment shared across most of the videos covering this game, I don't fully agree with it. So for today's video, I'm going to be throwing my own hat in the ring, analyzing the highs and lows to see if Kingdom Hearts 2 still deserves its crown 17 years later. But before we get started, I need to give a few reminders because I know some of you are going to mention it. Just like with the first game, Kingdom Hearts 2 would eventually see a final mix re-release. This version of the game saw quite a number of tweaks and improvements. The main attractions are the new endgame content, extra cutscenes, and the inclusion of an all-new difficulty option. Final Mix is the definitive version of the game because of these additions, and it's easily the most accessible version since it's included in all of the HD remasters. The vanilla release is still more than playable if you just want to blast through the main story content, but Final Mix is a vast improvement in almost every way. I also want to mention that there are going to be full story spoilers throughout this video. If you haven't played Kingdom Hearts 2 and are looking to go in blind, then I highly suggest you click off the video now and come back once you finish the game for yourself. This sort of thing should go without saying because of the video length, but I figure there's no harm in giving a verbal reminder. With all that said and done, let's get started.
A scattered dream that's like a far-off memory. A far-off memory that's like a scattered dream. I want to line the pieces up. Yours and mine.
Kingdom Hearts 2 has a rather unconventional opening. Rather than immediately following up on the plot threads from the previous two games, we're instead introduced to Roxas, a teenage boy living out the last week of his summer vacation in Twilight Town. Lately, there's been some strange anomalies happening around Roxas. These mysterious white creatures have stolen photos of the young man, Roxas is able to occasionally wield the Keyblade to fight back against the foes, Axel from the organization has also returned, and he seems to have a personal connection to Roxas, and on top of all of this, for the past few nights, Roxas has been having these strange dreams where he relives events from Kingdom Hearts 1. All of this culminates in the eventual revelation that the entire life Roxas knew was a lie. Not only is it revealed that the Twilight Town Roxas has been living in is nothing more than a simulation created by Diz, but we also learn that Roxas himself isn't technically real and is actually a being known as a nobody. You see, when a strong-willed person becomes a Heartless, the body left behind takes on a form of its own. To give an example, near the end of the first game, Sora sacrificed himself to restore Kairi's heart. While he did eventually get his body back, Sora becoming a Heartless is what led to the creation of both Roxas and Naminé, who are Sora's and Kairi's nobodies respectively. Because of Roxas's connection to Sora's heart, when Sora's memories were altered in Chain of Memories, it ended up having an effect on Roxas. While Roxas believed he was just a regular kid, in actuality, he was one of the members of Organization 13. He ended up getting captured by both Diz and Riku, and was then placed inside the simulated Twilight Town in order to keep him hidden from the organization long enough for Sora to complete his restoration. Diz explains to Roxas that he's the key to completing Sora, and whether he likes it or not, he has to merge with him. Roxas's tale comes to a tragic end as he accepts his fate and returns to Sora to complete the restoration process. Sora reawakens in the real Twilight Town, alongside Donald and Goofy. After some guidance from an undercover King Mickey, the trio is guided to Yensid's tower, where they're given a rundown on the situation. Despite Ansem's defeat at the end of the first game, the Heartless still pose a threat to the many worlds. However, this time, we have a new threat in the form of the Nobodies and Organization 13, a group of advanced nobodies looking to become whole again by harvesting enough hearts to create their own versions of Kingdom Hearts. Once again, it's up to Sora, Donald, and Goofy to travel the many Disney worlds, protect them from the new threats, locate and lock the new keyholes, and find their friends. When you boil it down, the goals of the characters are very similar to the first game, though enough is done differently here to keep the idea from feeling repetitive. However, I believe we should talk about the Roxas section in a bit more detail since it's a rather mixed topic. The opening hours of Kingdom Hearts 2 have become rather infamous over the years. I know I wasn't a huge fan of it when I first played the game, but as time has gone on, I've really grown to appreciate the Roxas segment. Call it an overly long tutorial all you want, but it serves an integral purpose to the overall narrative of the game. Mainly, the time spent in Twilight Town is used to endear us to Roxas as a character. When Roxas is first introduced to us, he's portrayed as an average teenager. He spends his time working part-time jobs, participating in local sporting events, and finishing up homework assignments. It sounds very lame and uninteresting on the surface, but I believe that's sort of the point. The mundaneness of it all ends up being juxtaposed with the fantastical. Elements we're familiar with begin to seep their way into Roxas' life, as the facade he lives in is slowly unraveled. Sure, investigating the 7 rumors of Twilight Town and delivering mail doesn't sound like fun or engaging gameplay, but it's done in service of the story. The game forces the player to embody Roxas during the opening hours so that we can connect with him on a personal level. We get to experience the the bonds he shares with his friends firsthand so that, when it all comes crashing down, it leaves an impact. If the Roxas section was shorter or was told exclusively through the cutscenes without any player interaction, then I believe that the character's tragic end wouldn't be nearly as effective. And since the conflict surrounding the nobodies is essential to the thematic core of Kingdom Hearts 2, I believe that sticking to landing on this part of the game was essential. But before I go into detail on what those themes are, I believe we should cover the gameplay aspects first. Just like the first game, Kingdom Hearts 2's main gameplay can be divided up into two separate facets, those being exploration and combat. Sora's moveset has been greatly expanded from the first game. Not only were returning mechanics reworked to be more interesting, but brand new ideas were introduced that greatly improved the combat. Just like the first game, basic Keyblade strikes are the bread and butter of the combat system. A new suite of abilities were introduced that allow you to customize your Keyblade combos with more depth than previously. While there were a few combo modifiers in the first game, the number of abilities available for you to choose from in Kingdom Hearts 2 is almost staggering in comparison. Attack animations are far quicker now, and you can maneuver Sora with much more grace than before. The new finishers introduced have a lot of weight behind them, which makes them very satisfying to use. The magic system has also been greatly reworked. There are a total of 6 different spells in this game, and while that might seem like a bit of a downgrade when compared to the original game's 7, it makes up for it in their utility. Returning spells were altered to stand out from each other beyond their elemental damage. Fire, for example, now does damage to enemies surrounding Sora, and Thunder comes with the added benefit of knocking enemies up into the air. The two new spells, Magnet and Reflect, behave very differently from the others. Magnet creates a vortex that sucks in surrounding enemies, making it great for crowd control. Reflect acts as an alternate guard that, with proper timing, can be used to dish out a lot of AoE damage. In the right hands, it can absolutely shred through certain enemies too, making it one of the best support spells in the game. Unlike Kingdom Hearts 1, magic can be integrated smoothly into combos. It's possible to weave in and out spells as long as you have the MP for it. Speaking of which, the MP bar was drastically changed for the better. When the MP bar is fully drained, you'll enter the MP recharge state. It essentially acts as a cooldown for your magic, and once the purple bar is depleted, you'll be given back a full MP bar. The time it takes for MP recharge to complete can be decreased through abilities and items. I find this system to be an improvement for a few reasons. In Kingdom Hearts 1, spells like Cure were heavily exploitable. It only cost a single unit of magic, which meant as long as you had the MP and the ability Leaf Bracer equipped, it could be spammed to soak through damage. Using Cure in Kingdom Hearts 2 will force you into the MP recharge state, but in return will always fully heal Sora. This encourages more strategic use of healing magic. You can use Cure anytime you want, but the moment you do so, you'll be forced to enter a cooldown period. If you're in a situation where you want to heal but you have a lot of MP left, it might be a good idea to quickly fire off some spells to get some extra damage in. Another new use for the MP bar is the reworked limit breaks. While limits existed in Kingdom Hearts 1, they functioned very differently since they were limited to special attacks that only Sora could use. However, in Kingdom Hearts 2, by spending all of your current MP, Sora will be able to enter the limit state with a partner. This provides both Sora and his partner with special attacks, and comes with the added benefit of being fully invincible. Every party member in the game has their own unique limit that adds some extra flair to combat, and also does some decent damage. Party members can also now be switched out mid-combat in case you think your current team isn't up to scratch. A new mechanic to Kingdom Hearts 2 is drive forms. They act as temporary transformations that greatly alter your combat abilities. Drive forms are acquired throughout the game and can be activated by spending a large quantity of your drive gauge. With Goofy in your party, you'll be able to enter Valor form. This allows you to dual-wield Keyblades to perform some flashy and powerful combos. However, it comes with the drawbacks of not being able to guard or use magic. With Donald in the party, you'll be able to enter Wisdom form and trade physical strength for boosted magic. By using both Donald and Goofy, you'll be able to enter Master form, which boasts some of the best aerial combos in the game and allows you to endlessly combo magic until you run out of MP. Final form is a jack of all trades. It's solid in a lot of areas, though Master form and Wisdom form do beat it out in certain situations. Final form is also the most expensive drive form, costing 5 drive gauges to activate and will burn through them quickly depending on the attacks. Exclusive to Final Mix is Limit form. It gives you a similar moveset to what Sora had in Kingdom Hearts 1. While it has the worst mobility in the game, it makes up for it everywhere else. The exclusive limit attacks are extremely powerful, come with a lot of invincibility frames, and also regenerate HP with each hit. Limit form is also the only drive form you can activate when Sora is by himself, meaning you can use it even if Donald and Goofy are knocked out. Drive forms are an incredibly powerful tool, and in the hands of the right player, they can completely destroy most random encounters. However, you can't just spam drive forms, not just because you need the proper number of drive gauges to use them, but because you always run the risk of transforming into Anti-Sora. This form is meant to serve as a punishment for being overly reliant on drive forms. Anti-Sora can only use physical attacks to deal damage. While his attacks aren't that powerful, his DPS is solid enough to make it almost a non-issue. The biggest drawbacks of Anti-Form are that you cannot manually revert mid-battle, you lose all access to magic and items, and you gain 0 experience from enemies. Drive forms are a great idea since they allow you to tailor your strategy towards certain playstyles. Each of them excels in different ways, but also come with their own set of drawbacks that keep them from becoming too overpowered. You're heavily encouraged to use drive forms as much as possible, since they serve as an avenue for unlocking new mobility options for Sora's base form. For example, by leveling up Master Form, you'll gain access to a double jump. Final Form gives you the glide ability, and Wisdom Form gives you quick run. Drive forms don't gain experience in a traditional sense. Instead, each drive form has a unique way of leveling up. Valor Form gains experience for each Keyblade strike you land on an enemy, and Limit Form gains experience for every successful limit you perform. While each form rewards you with exclusive abilities, you definitely want to level them up for the sake of expanding your movement options. The last main mechanic to talk about are summons. They function a bit differently this time around. For starters, summons no longer take any MP and now work entirely off of the drive gauge. The number of summons have been cut down from 6 to 4, which might seem a bit disappointing at first, but I find that summons, much like magic, have a lot more utility here. Summons take on a more supportive role, with each one aiding Sora in different ways. Chicken Little is the first summon you get, and he specializes in crowd controlling methods. Genie mimics your currently unlocked drive forms and has some of the most powerful attacks of any summon. Stitch is a bit of a wild card. He can stun enemies with his ukulele, protect you from certain attacks with his ray gun, and most importantly of all, he has the ability to refill your MP bar. Much like the almighty Bambi before him, Stitch is a great summon for taking care of random encounters. And finally, there's Peter Pan. He functions pretty similarly to Tinkerbell from the first game, though he comes with an exclusive limit that can be used to stun enemies. I'll be honest, I don't really use him that much. The health regeneration and revive are nice and all, but I find that the other summons are better options most of the time. If you can't tell, you have a lot of shit at your disposal, and this isn't even considering the amount of customization you have thanks to the different keyblades and equipment. When comparing KH1 to KH2, it might be easy to just call the combat here an objective improvement over the first game, and while, as a whole, I find the combat to be better, it's not without its faults. Kingdom Hearts 2 is commonly referred to as a button masher. While I disagree with this statement, it's not hard to see why some people think this way. While the game has a very healthy variety of enemies, most of them can be defeated in a rather similar fashion. Your basic Keyblade combo is all you really need to make it to the end of the game when playing on normal, and even Proud Mode to some extent. I know for a fact that on my first playthrough, I would rely exclusively on melee attacks, while also not putting in any thought into which abilities I would equip. This is the most common way I see people play this game, and I believe that this is a consequence of two different factors. Not only does difficulty play a huge part in this, but I also believe that Kingdom Hearts 2 does a pretty bad job at not only explaining its mechanics, but also encouraging players to interact with them. The combat tutorial for Kingdom Hearts 2 is pretty shallow. It teaches you the bare essentials and doesn't really dive deep into the details. On one hand, this keeps pop-up messages to a minimum, but it comes with the consequence of certain mechanics being poorly explained. Let's use summons as an example. As I already went over, summons are meant to complement Sora's basic moveset. Each one serves a different role and comes with its own set of quirks for you to consider. While not every situation is suited for a summon, they can be a great tool to use against random encounters and even some boss battles. However, the game fails to communicate their effectiveness to the player. The only tutorial relating to summons is how you're supposed to access them through the command menu. While there is some additional information that can be found regarding summons, it's tucked away in the status screen. Even with this extra information, you're not exactly given a great idea as to what summons are capable of. This same issue applies to drive forms and even magic to some extent. You're given a quick message introducing these mechanics, and from then on, it's left up to the player to figure out the rest. For example, magic is greatly altered while in a drive form. Not only is its power increased, but the casting method is also tweaked depending on the currently activated form. While something like Blizzard is functionally the same across all forms, certain properties of the spell are changed between each form. The same is true for all magic in the game, even spells you wouldn't think would be altered like Magnet and Reflect. This adds a new layer of complexity to drives and magic that open up plenty of opportunities for experimentation. There's nothing in the game that explicitly mentions this design choice. It's left entirely up to the player to not only discover this for themselves, but to also figure out the potential utility this tool provides. Because of the obscurity of it all, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a section of the player base that doesn't even know that magic can be used in much more creative ways than they think. However, even if all this information was explained properly, we still have the issue of encouraging players to experiment with these mechanics. In the standard difficulty options, there's almost nothing in the main campaign that requires you to change up your fighting style. It's very feasible to get through the entire story mode only relying on the different Keyblade combos and reaction commands you're provided. While there is fun to be had with the spectacle of it all, it's a shame that a lot of the combat options aren't necessarily needed. Kingdom Hearts 1 arguably does a better job at getting players to use most, if not all of the tools they have at their disposal. Because of Sora's more limited moveset, there's a much higher chance that players are willing to experiment. Not just for the sake of adding some extra variety to the combat, but because there were some scenarios where a head-on approach wouldn't quite cut it. The long wind-up times and clunkier movement encouraged a more methodical playstyle, since you couldn't just solely rely on the Keyblade for every encounter. While it's more than doable to play the first game with a button-mashing mindset, you're more likely to run into roadblocks later on in the journey. Kingdom Hearts 1 also did a better job at incentivizing experimentation through the tech point system. Tech points were bonus experience points that can be earned by fulfilling certain requirements in battle. This could range from properly parrying enemy attacks and exploiting elemental weaknesses. While you could argue that the reward in itself was a bit lacking, the general design behind tech points is a good idea. It incentivizes creative play and encourages the player to, at the very least, test out all of their abilities to see what works. It also allows for a more experienced player to gain levels a bit faster during repeat playthroughs. I know it sounds like I'm kind of dogging on Kingdom Hearts 2's combat, but I just wanted to give a few reasons as to why I think some people claim this game is a button masher. In actuality, I believe that the combat system has a lot more depth than a lot of people give it credit for, but what it ultimately boils down to is the kind of player that you are. Alright, I guess it's time to get into it. Let's quickly break down the concepts of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Yeah, I bet you weren't expecting to hear that in a conversation about Kingdom Hearts. To put it as simply as possible, being intrinsically motivated means you're able to make your own fun. These kinds of players probably prefer more open-ended games where there aren't any clearly defined goals. On the other side of the spectrum, we have the more extrinsically motivated. These are the types of players that perform tasks for the sake of a reward. For example, let's say you're playing a game that features a lot of side quests that are only subpar in quality. An extrinsically motivated player would be more likely to complete these side quests because they receive a reward for doing so, whether that be an item or extra story details. Now that we have this baseline established, how does this relate back to Kingdom Hearts? Well, it's quite simple. The core combat of Kingdom Hearts 2 appeals to the more intrinsically motivated than it does the extrinsically motivated. It's undeniable that there are a lot more options for you to play around with. The systems in place are very easy to understand, and the tools you have access to can be smoothly weaved in and out of combos. This is part of the reason why Kingdom Hearts 2 has a very active speedrunning community. There are so many different ways to approach any given combat scenario, and when you fully understand the mechanics in place, the strings you can create are almost jaw-dropping. But when looking at the other side of the coin, the extrinsically motivated might feel a bit left out. While there is a lot of content for you to tackle in Kingdom Hearts 2, there isn't much in the combat system itself that encourages you to break away from mashing the X button, aside from the difficulty that comes from fighting the optional bosses. This is a bit strange since KH1 included some extrinsic motivation in the form of the tech point system that I mentioned earlier. KH2 doesn't have anything like that, and I think that if a similar system was included, then it would go a long way in getting people to really master the tools that they have access to. However, that's not to say that there aren't any good incentives to experiment. One of my favorite sections of the game is Port Royal, the world based on Pirates of the Caribbean. While that might seem like an odd choice at first, the reason why I like it so much is because of how the combat was altered a bit. Port Royal is the only world in the game that not only makes you consider how the combat arenas are designed, but also rewards you for using some of your other tools. As the game blatantly points out, Barbossa's pirates only take damage while in the moonlight. However, it's also established that the pirate enemies are weak to magic. Blizzard, fire, and thunder spells all come with secondary effects that can be used to your advantage. However, summons also come in handy here. Chicken Little's ability to group enemies together allows you to easily reposition the pirates anywhere on the field. Stitch is also a good choice since you can use magic as much as you want without having to worry about running out of MP. The best part about Port Royal is that the same rule applies to the bosses. The enemies end up acting as a tutorial to develop strategies against the bosses, which is a really clever way of getting players to experiment. It's a bit disappointing to see that this is the only section in the game that encourages experimentation to this degree. I can actually imagine some people building a resentment towards the world because of it. Because of Port Royal's unique gimmicks, it's a lot more difficult to rely exclusively on melee combos. Since this playstyle was conditioned for most of the game, suddenly having to worry about enemy positioning might throw a wrench into those plans. However, I think it's the unique gameplay gimmicks that make Port Royal stand out a lot more than the other Disney worlds to me. I believe I should also mention the elephant in the room. Most of the footage you've been seeing up until now has been from Proud Mode. This was the hardest difficulty in Vanilla Kingdom Hearts 2. However, one of the additions to Final Mix was the inclusion of a brand new difficulty called Critical Mode. For the longest time, I only ever played KH2 on Proud Mode, but for the sake of this video, I decided to do a full playthrough of Critical Mode to get a better perspective on the combat system. So, does the added challenge of Critical Mode help encourage more experimentation in combat? In my opinion anyways, I think it does. What makes Critical Mode special is that it's far more than just a few stat changes. Sure, Critical Mode halves your maximum HP and enemies deal double damage, but the trade-off is that the damage you deal is also increased. Not only that, but you also start off the game with some extra abilities, such as a faster MP recharge time, and being able to perform an extra combo finisher right out of the gate. Critical Mode encourages a bit more of a methodical playstyle, since getting caught off guard can result in a quick death. Because of this, ranged options are actually a lot more valuable here, since they allow you to deal damage from a safe distance. The invincibility frames provided by limits also show their potential here, making it more likely that you'll take advantage of the ability. The added challenge of Critical Mode inherently encourages you to change up your tactics. Knowing how to deal with every enemy in the game is crucial to your survival, and the game gives you all the tools needed to deal with any situation. While there's still no in-depth tutorial how certain mechanics work, you're at the very least guided down the path of experimentation. On the whole, I find the core combat of Kingdom Hearts 2 to be a lot of fun. Sora's moveset was greatly expanded from the first game. Not only were returning ideas tweaked and changed to be a lot more interesting, but plenty of new mechanics were also introduced. Drive forms add a new layer of options that didn't exist previously. Magic and summons are also a lot more versatile and are a ton of fun to play around with. I know I just spent the last few paragraphs critiquing certain design elements, but that's because I genuinely believe the game does a poor job at conveying the potential of its mechanics. As I said earlier, it ultimately boils down to the type of player that you are. If you're the type of player that sticks with the melee combos throughout the game, then more power to you. As long as you're having fun, who am I to tell you that you're playing the game wrong? I just wish that Kingdom Hearts 2 did a better job at explaining its mechanics and giving players an incentive to experiment outside of personal satisfaction. Though, if you are the kind of person that likes to use everything at your disposal, then you're in for some of the best combat you can get out of an action RPG. You might be wondering why I spent so much time talking about the combat of this game. Well, that's because that's where most of the gameplay content lies. I found Kingdom Hearts 1 to be a pretty unique experience, since it combined combat with traditional platforming elements. While both of these aspects weren't perfect, when these two states were mixed together, it ended up working out rather well. Part of the charm of the first KH game was its world design. Every stage had a unique gimmick to set itself apart from the others, whether that be in how the level was structured, the light puzzle solving, or even the objectives. From what I can gather, when KH1 was first released, the platforming sections received a lot of criticism for being too clunky and confusing to navigate. I guess Square took that personally because they completely neutered the exploration in Kingdom Hearts 2. While the worlds are a lot more spacious, the level design is very flat and uninteresting. Sure, there's a treasure chest to find here and there, but it's not enough to make up for it. Something that was really cool about the Disney worlds in the first game was the level of interaction you had. It really felt like they gamified aspects of these films and made it feel like you were actually exploring these locations. The removal of this aspect comes off as a drastic overcorrection to the criticism the first game received more than anything. It's like they saw that people didn't like the platforming that much, and instead of improving it, the developers just said fuck it and took it out entirely. It's funny because by the time Final Mix came out, they attempted to retroactively include more exploration thanks to the puzzle pieces. But since none of the level design was altered to accommodate this, it comes off as rather slapdash. There are so many different movement options thanks to the growth abilities you get from drive forms, and while they're all useful for combat, part of me yearns to see how the world design could have taken advantage of this. Final Mix does give us a glimpse of the potential Sora's movement has on the level design thanks to the Cavern of Remembrance. This optional dungeon requires you to use all of Sora's movement abilities in order to progress, and it really highlights how much fun traversal can be when the level design compensates for it. That's not to say that Kingdom Hearts 2 doesn't try to do anything interesting with its world, because it does. However, just like the first game, the execution ends up being a bit of a mixed bag. The Pride Lands and Atlantica are the two standout examples of this. Lion Cub Sora suffers from a lot of the same issues Atlantica did in the first game. It's a lack of combat options mainly, because control-wise, it's much better than the swimming was. Despite having a few exclusive moves, Lion Sora ends up being rather uninteresting to play. Atlantica is also kind of crappy. It was turned into a horribly offbeat rhythm game that practically plays itself. I appreciate the idea of adding some musical elements to the game since Disney is well known for that, but let's just say that I'm thankful that it's optional. Speaking of which, there's a lot of optional content in this game. There's the Olympus Coliseum matches, if you want to test your strength against waves of enemy hordes, though this time around, the different cups all come with varying rule sets to shake things up a bit. The final tournament, the Hades Paradox Cup, periodically switches out its restrictions and comes with its own unique encounters to deal with. The Mushroom 13 tests out different aspects of your abilities in unique and sometimes unconventional ways, such as testing how long you can juggle an enemy, how many attacks you can reflect, or a standard DPS check. These two pieces of content serve as fun distractions. However, when you mention the Kingdom Hearts 2 post-game to someone, chances are they'll think of the plethora of optional super bosses. Kingdom Hearts 1 had its fair share of post-game fights, each one of them testing you on different aspects of the combat system, such as your ability to reflect projectiles and managing your magic. When Kingdom Hearts 2 was first released, a lot of this content was scaled back. Sure, there was still the boss fight against Sephiroth, but beyond that, the post-game was rather lacking in comparison. Final Mix completely fixed this issue, as it would end up including 14 brand new post-game boss fights. There are the rematches against the Organization 13 members and the boss fight against this mysterious clad of armor known as the Lingering Will. These fights are some of the best content Kingdom Hearts 2 has to offer. Not only is every single one of them a fun and fair challenge, but they all come with their own unique gameplay quirks you need to take into consideration. While some of these are just souped up rematches of story bosses, about half of them are completely new fights. The Organization members from Chain of Memories received complete design overhauls to fit within the bounds of KH2's combat system, and are way more fun to fight because of it. The Lingering Will is my favorite boss fight in the game. He's fast, powerful, and has the widest variety of attacks in the game, making him the toughest boss to take down. I remember spending so many hours trying to beat this guy in my first playthrough, and just barely scraping by when I did. You need to know when to properly guard, what moves he has at his disposal and how to react appropriately to them, and know how to take advantage of his openings. It's a fight that's been ingrained in my muscle memory at this point, and while I don't have nearly as much trouble now as I did back then, I still get a kick out of landing that final blow. Before we end the gameplay discussion, let's quickly take a look at the Gummy Ship. I'm more so doing this out of a formality since it's the only bit of gameplay I haven't talked about yet. The Gummy Ship sections in Kingdom Hearts 1 weren't that interesting in all honesty. I was more so a fan of its concept than execution. It helped contextualize the Disney worlds as a physical place in this universe that you could travel to. There was a sense of childlike wonder to be had while piloting this vessel in hopes of discovering new worlds. What really helped was that you were able to fully customize your Gummy Ship in any way you wanted. While the gameplay ultimately boiled down to being a bare-bones Star Fox clone, it served to help build anticipation for whatever world you'd come across next. Kingdom Hearts 2 changed the Gummy Ship sections rather dramatically. Sure, you could still customize your ship, but the actual gameplay is more akin to a bullet hell. There's far more energy behind these sections than previously, and are a lot more visually stimulating. I'd say that it's a marginal improvement over what we had previously, but it still didn't leave much of a lasting impact. That covers all of the major gameplay facets, and as a whole, I find Kingdom Hearts 2 to be a massive step forward from the first game. While it's true that the level design takes a back seat from the first game, I don't really find it to be that distracting because Kingdom Hearts 2 clearly puts a much larger emphasis on its combat system. Almost all of the content in the game is in service of those mechanics. This makes KH2 much more comparable to an action game than a platformer, and whether or not you're a fan of this new direction will determine how much mileage you can get out of this game. That's not me trying to say you're wrong for wishing that there's more platforming, because I do agree to an extent. Sora's moveset has a lot of potential, and while some of it can be tapped tapped into for combat purposes, I wish the level design also took advantage of it. We got to see a glimpse of this in the Cavern of Remembrance, but I would have loved to have seen what it would have looked like if an entire world was designed around these abilities. However, I think it's pretty clear that most of the focus went into the combat specifically. Yes, the world design is a bit lacking, but I find that the sheer mechanical depth on offer here more than makes up for it. The flexibility and skill ceiling of the combat is what keeps me coming back to it. That's not to say that the game is objectively superior because of it, but as someone who's really into action games, I find that Kingdom Hearts 2 appeals more to what I look for in a game than what the first one does. With all of that out of the way, I believe it's time we fully dive into the story. As a reminder, I'm going to be dishing out spoilers throughout the rest of this video, so if what you've seen has interested you, then I recommend you play the game yourself before watching the rest. With all of that out of the way, let's go into a bit more detail as to what's going on here. To give a brief reminder, after Sora, Donald, and Goofy wake up from their year-long nap, they learn that the many different worlds are still in danger, not just from the returning Heartless, but a new threat has emerged in the form of nobodies in Organization 13. So once again, it's up to our main trio to venture into the many different worlds to lock up the keyholes and eventually take down the organization. Kingdom Hearts 2 is commonly referred to as the point where the series became too complex for its own good, though I don't agree with that statement. When breaking down the general goals and motivations of the characters, things aren't all that different from the first game. Sure, an extra layer of complexity was added to the story thanks to the nobodies being fully established, but I'd say it's overall a net positive. Not only does this new threat allow for some creative and distinct enemy design, but it also serves as a natural complement to the Heartless. While the Heartless are these animalistic creatures, nobodies in comparison are much more plotting. Nobodies are meant to represent the last splinter of someone's humanity and end up mimicking their past lives. This is portrayed both in their enemy design and animations. Almost every nobody in the game, save for a few outliers, is meant to mimic one of the jobs from an old school Final Fantasy game. There's the dancers, dragoons, berserkers, gamblers, and the list goes on. These jobs are used as a basis for enemy types, and I find it to be a pretty clever way of incorporating more Final Fantasy representation in this crossover. One of my favorite details with the nobodies is in their animations. It's less natural and more so looks that they're being pulled around the arenas like puppets on a string. This creates a really uncanny movement that feeds into the idea of them being creatures that attempt to replicate human tendencies. This also applies to Organization 13 and leads to a pretty solid twist involving that group. About halfway through the game, we learn that Ansem, Seeker of Darkness, isn't who he claimed to be. Rather, he was the Heartless of a man named Xehanort, and the real Ansem is actually the true identity of Diz. It turns out that Xehanort was actually an apprentice of the real Ansem, and was performing experiments to learn more about the human heart. Though Ansem would go on and shut down the experiments upon learning of how inhumane they were, Xehanort, out of spite, would go on to steal Ansem's identity and research, eventually turning himself into a Heartless to gain more power, but by doing so, this would also create a powerful nobody named Xemnas, who just so happens to be the leader of Organization 13. It's also revealed that most of the other members of the organization were also former apprentices of Ansem, who, after being swayed to Xehanort's side, would also turn into nobodies. After being betrayed by his former apprentice, Ansem, now going by Diz, is looking to get revenge by any means necessary. That's definitely a lot to take in at once, but I actually think that this is a pretty solid twist, all things considered. It's essentially a way of bringing back the villain from the first game, but in a way that stays consistent with the rest of the universe. But let's not beat around the bush here. I have enough self-awareness to realize how dumb this all sounds. I totally get why some people can't take this seriously, but I find that the pure insanity of these concepts is what makes Kingdom Hearts so special. I like that it has an air of confidence in what it is, and I think that would be lost if the characters were constantly winking at the camera to remind me that it knows it's dumb. It reminds me a lot of comic books in a way, where you know that what you're seeing is pretty out there and hard to take seriously, but you still let yourself get invested anyways because it leads to mad payoff. That's not to say that I only get ironic enjoyment out of the narrative, because even though it's easy to laugh at its core, Kingdom Hearts 2 does have something meaningful to say, and it's done with so much earnesty that you can't help but admire it.
Well, there is one advantage to being me. Something you can never imitate.
Really? What's that?
Having you for a friend.
Then I guess I'm okay the way I am. I've got something you could never imitate too.
Kingdom Hearts 2, much like the previous game, is heavily criticized for its use of Disney worlds. They're commonly referred to as filler that doesn't contribute much in the overarching narrative. In a literal sense, it's hard to disagree with this, since a majority of what happens in these worlds are glorified recaps of their respective films. Every once in a while, the game does break free of this crutch and attempts to tell a more original story, but for the most part, what you see is what you get. However, just like the first Kingdom Hearts game, I find that if you take a step back and look at all these worlds in a broad sense, there's more to enjoy. Almost every Disney world in the game is connected through the themes of identity and purpose. Think of the films that were chosen for this game: Mulan, Beauty and the Beast, The Lion King, A Nightmare Before Christmas. Hell, even Pirates of the Caribbean. All of these movies deal with these themes in some form or another. This is important because these are the same themes that are tackled in the game's main plot. While the stories themselves aren't altered much from their film counterparts, because they share similar themes to the overarching narrative, they end up fitting in rather well. The keyword here is almost, since there are a few Disney worlds that don't follow this trend. Some of them, such as Space Paranoids and Timeless River, make up for it in the context surrounding those worlds. Space Paranoids is portrayed as the Hollow Bastion security system, and Timeless River is meant to represent the distant past, which I'll admit is a really clever idea, and I love the way this world looks. While it's nice to have this thematic link between most of the worlds, it's hard to deny that Kingdom Hearts 1 did a better job at making the Disney worlds feel more important to the overall plot. This was because while the worlds would follow the plots of the movies, we would see the original Kingdom Hearts story seep its way into it. The execution wasn't perfect, but I can think of a few standout examples of worlds going above and beyond the basics. Kingdom Hearts 2 doesn't fully take advantage of this idea. The closest we get are the few times where Organization 13 appears to cause some trouble. The second visit to Beast Castle is the best example of this, since the organization member Zaldin ends up being the primary antagonist of this world. He wants to use Beast to help further the organization's goal, and Zaldin's boss act as the bookend for that world. I find this to be a good way of integrating the overarching plot into the Disney world beyond thematics. However, it's still nothing compared to how Monstro and Neverland were handled in the first game. Don't get me wrong, just because I find the overall implementation of the Disney worlds to be a bit weaker here, it doesn't mean that I find them pointless. It's sometimes easy to forget that one of the main appeals of this franchise is being able to interact with these iconic characters. You get to explore these worlds beyond what was shown in the films, and like it or not, this fan service definitely attracted people to the franchise. And as I said earlier, I don't think the stories of these worlds are a waste of time since, similarly to Kingdom Hearts 1, they tie into the game's overarching themes of identity and purpose. The members of Organization 13 highlight this perfectly. Nobodies lack hearts and can't feel real emotions. While they can imitate them to a degree and even convince themselves that they have real emotions, at the end of the day, they're just a shadow of their former selves. What Organization 13 desires is to create their own Kingdom Hearts so they can make themselves feel whole again. It's a dream that the members cling onto so that they feel like they have a purpose. While the organization can be seen in a sympathetic light because of their struggles, it's ultimately how they go about accomplishing their goals that make them the antagonists. I think the only reason as to why I feel this way about these characters is because of the time we spent with Roxas. The opening hours in Twilight Town were meant to endear us towards his character, not just so that his tragedy would hit harder, but because it was used to demonstrate the existentialism that the nobodies go through. Roxas managed to convince himself that he lived a fairly average life while in the simulated Twilight Town. While in a literal sense it was a lie, it didn't matter because it felt real to him. This is why when everything comes crashing down around Roxas, he can't help but get frustrated and angry. Roxas has to come to grips with who and what he really is, and while he does end up returning to Sora, Roxas harbors a lot of resentment towards him. This all culminates in their encounter in the world that never was. It's because of Roxas's connection to Sora that he's unable to live his own life. This boss fight is meant to be Roxas's final attempt to claim his independence. Though it's through this struggle that Roxas is able to realize why Sora is the one that needs to go on. While it might not be what he wanted, Roxas now knows his true purpose is to be one with Sora. The Keyblade you're given for finishing this fight is symbolic of that. Roxas lets himself fade away, though this time it's without regret or anger, and he's finally able to achieve peace. The core theme of identity is also felt within Riku's character. Chain of Memories established Riku's ongoing battle with his inner darkness. While he was able to control it for a while, by the time Kingdom Hearts 2 rolls around, he ultimately regressed. During his battle with Roxas, Riku needed to tap into the power of darkness in order to gain the upper hand. However, this came with the consequence of transforming him into Xehanort's Heartless. This new appearance serves as a reminder of his failures, and Riku himself decided to embrace that. He cast away his identity and assisted Sora from the shadows. Riku was afraid of facing his friends after the mistakes he made, but more importantly, he was afraid of facing himself. Riku's story is about him accepting the parts of himself that he doesn't want to acknowledge and learning to move on from his past mistakes. The final act of the game is pretty compelling. I already mentioned what it does thematically, but I also find it to be a great section in terms of gameplay. The final battle against Xemnas feels appropriately climactic. It's a multi-phase boss fight that sees you taking down different structures before ending it against Xemnas himself. The presentation is turned up to an 11, featuring some of the best music in the game, along with coming with plenty of spectacle. Something that I appreciate is the decision to make Riku your partner for this section of the game. Throughout the entirety of Kingdom Hearts 1, Riku was portrayed as an obstacle for you to overcome, a rival turned antagonist. This makes the team up feel all the more special since it's the two boys finally reconciling, putting aside whatever happened in the past so that they can move forward to a brighter future. I mean, it also helps that they have the coolest looking limit in the entire game, but the point still stands. Something that I appreciate about the ending of Kingdom Hearts 2 is the conclusiveness of it all. The game ends with Sora and the gang finally accomplishing their goals. There's an air of finality to this ending, even though it does come with a sense of bittersweetness thanks to what happens to Roxas and the other nobodies. I know it's a bit funny to say that in hindsight, considering how much more was added to the story and future entries, but in all honesty, I would have been satisfied if things ended here. The mission our character set out on from the first game was finally complete. They found their friends, they beat the bad guys, and now they've returned home. The ending of Kingdom Hearts 2 is super satisfying because of this, and while there is some room left open for expansion, it wasn't really anything that was begging for a follow-up like the first two games had. I'm not trying to discredit the games that came after KH2, because they do have good qualities to them, but I find that the ending we got here was the only one that felt like it came with any real closure to the overarching story. I know that some people might not agree with that, and that's totally fine, but for me, this was the best ending that we've ever gotten in this franchise. As a whole, Kingdom Hearts 2 is a fantastic game that still holds up all these years later. The combat system is one of the best you can find in the genre. There's a large amount of fun and challenging optional content, and while I think the game does a pretty poor job at getting the players to experiment with its systems, the fact we can even have an in-depth conversation about these mechanics is pretty impressive. However, because of this large focus on combat, the level design ends up taking a bit of a back seat. I can understand why some players are disappointed in this shift in direction. The first game put a large emphasis on its world design and exploration. Getting to explore these famous movie locations in a more intimate fashion was part of the appeal of the original game. That's not to say that KH2 doesn't do this, but it's significantly scaled back in comparison. However, I'm of the opinion that its core systems more than make up for it. To put it simply, I just find the core combat too much fun to really care about that sort of thing. I know this might sound a bit shallow, but it's just what always appeals to me the most when playing an action game, even though this one has much more in common with an RPG than anything. Kingdom Hearts 2 is a really special game to me. While it does take a couple of steps back in a few areas, when looking at Kingdom Hearts 2 as a whole, I believe it outclasses the original game in the areas where it counts. Kingdom Hearts 2 is one of my favorite games of all time, and it's something that I find myself wanting to replay at least once every year. Not just because I find the combat to be incredibly smooth, but because I get unironic enjoyment out of the game's narrative. Despite how dumb it can be at times, I find that the story still resonates with me on an emotional level. Is it perfect? Oh god no. But if there's anything you should take away from this video, it's that those imperfections are what gives Kingdom Hearts 2 its identity. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I'd like to give a special shout out to all of my channel supporters whose names are on screen now. It's because of these lovely people that I'm able to make videos at the pace I do currently. These videos take a while to make, so if you're at all interested in helping out and donating, you can do so through my Patreon or channel memberships. I have a few things I can offer in return, such as early video access, a special Discord role, and even some behind the scenes content on occasion. Every donation helps, and if the rewards I mentioned sound interesting to you, then you can find out more by following the links in the description. This video was pretty tough to write in all honesty, not because I was struggling to find anything to talk about, but because I wanted to make absolutely sure that I got all of my thoughts out there, while also staying as unbiased as possible. As I said in the video, this is one of my favorite games of all time, and while I did my fair share of gushing about it, I think I managed to provide some worthwhile critiques too. This has been a video I've been wanting to make for a very long time, and I'm glad I finally got around to it. I've had my entire Proud Mode playthrough recorded since last November, believe it or not. In terms of future Kingdom Hearts videos, it's a bit up in the air currently, because I'm not entirely sure if I have much to say about the games that came after 2. I'm going to make an exception for Kingdom Hearts 3 since that game is still relatively new, so the discussion surrounding it hasn't completely dried up yet, and I think it can offer a bit more of a nuanced take. But when it comes to games like 358, Recoded, and Dream Drop Distance, it's a bit up in the air currently. Maybe I'll talk about Birth by Sleep to test the waters, but as of right now, I think I'll just be skipping right to Kingdom Hearts 3. Aside from that, the next video is going to be on Persona Q2. After a whole year since the video I made on the first one, I finally got around to playing the sequel. I have all the footage recorded already, so you won't have to wait too long for that one. If you want to stay up to date with that and other upcoming videos, then I encourage you to follow my Twitter and join my Discord server. Both will be linked in the description. Once again, I'd like to thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you all next time.